Welcome to Pen Making 101 with Mr. P. Today we're going to be doing a slimline pen. To start, you're going to need a block of wood, a pen kit. You're also going to need your tape measure, a pencil, and a square for marking straight across the board. The first thing we're going to do here is we're going to get out one of the pen tubes, and we will be measuring it so that we know how long to cut the block. Make sure you keep all of the other parts back in the bag and seal that bag up so we don't lose anything before we need it. You'll notice that with the slimline tubes here that it's a little over 2 inches, and so we're going to make our block 2 1/4 of an inch and double check that the whole block is then 4.5 inches long. So our mark is at 2.5, which is exactly 1/2 of the block. Using the square, draw your line straight across, and then we want to indicate the grain so that we can match it up later. And if you're doing multiple blocks, we want to put some kind of an indicator on either side so that we can match those up later as well. That's helpful when we're doing multiple blocks of the same kind of wood. Double check to make sure that our blocks, when they're cut, are going to be longer than the tube, and then we're going to go to the bandsaw and set up the bandsaw. We want to make sure that the bandsaw blade guard is about 1/4 of an inch above the block that we're cutting. Lock it in place, and then we're going to cut that block in half. We're going to cut the block by carefully guiding it through and then pulling it off to the side and away from the blade. Shut the saw back off, and we want to go ahead and wait for it to stop. Back at our table, we're going to mark the ends for drilling. Notice that we're using the ends that have that grain indicator line, and we're going to use our square to draw a diagonal line straight across from one corner to the other, and then again the other direction to create an X on the end of the blocks. That provides a center location for us when we get to the drill press. We're going to do it on both blocks. And now you'll see that we're ready to go to the drill press because we've got an X on the end. Now, with the X on top, we're going to clamp it into the V grooves of the clamp, the vise at the drill press. We want to line it up so that the point of the drill bit goes right into the center of the X, which locates our middle, and we want to make sure that we are locked up in those V grooves so that the block is straight up and down. When we drill, we want to make sure that we're cleaning out the bit as we go. Drill down a little bit, clean it out, drill down a little bit, clean it out, so that we are not binding the drill bit with sawdust and wood chips. Turn it off when you've drilled through, wait for it to stop, and then we're going to swap out the drilled block that has the hole all the way through it, centered, for the second block. Again, we're going to make sure we have the X on top. Clamp it into the V grooves of the vise, and then we're going to line the point of the drill bit up with the center of our X again. Drill, and as we're drilling, we're going to continually clean out the bit until we've gone all the way through, and then make sure we've got a clean hole all the way through the block. Turn off the drill press, wait for it to stop, and then we move our block, and we can see that we've drilled all the way through. Once we have both blocks drilled, we can go back to the table and get ready for gluing our tubes in. So we have our blocks with the holes drilled. We have an insert tool, which will be helpful when putting it in. Sandpaper to use to scratch up the tubes. Gorilla Glue for gluing. And we're going to pull the second tube out of the bag as well, so that we have both tubes. One tube will get glued into each block, and we will be using the sandpaper as a way to scratch up the tubes so that the glue has some more holding power between the tube and the block of wood. So by grabbing just a scrap piece of sandpaper, we twist it around the tube, and we want to make sure that we've got it nice and scratched up. It takes any oil off the tube, and it also gives it a little bit more of a surface for that glue to stick to. And if you look carefully, you can see the difference between the tube that hasn't been sanded and the one that has. So if we flip it around halfway, do about half of it, and then spin it, you can do the other half so that the entire tube has been scruffed up from the sandpaper. Now we're going to take some paper towel, the Gorilla Glue, and the insert tool and use it to put the tubes into the two wooden blocks. Taking one tube and the Gorilla Glue, we want to put a little bead of glue across the top, similar to putting toothpaste on a toothbrush. And then we're going to insert it into one end of the block. Spin it as we're twisting and pushing. We want to use the glue on the outside of the tube to coat the inside of the block. Be careful not to get the Gorilla Glue on your fingers. If you get the Gorilla Glue on your fingers, it is very, very sticky and it's hard to get cleaned off. Double check to make sure that the inside of your block is completely coated with the Gorilla Glue. And then using the insert tool, we're going to slide it in the rest of the way and make sure that the tube is left inside and not sticking out past the ends of the block. Always make sure to wipe the glue off of the insert tool between uses and when you're finished with it. Now we're going to repeat the process with the second glue tube and block. Make sure to put the cap back on the Gorilla Glue so that the Gorilla Glue does not dry out. Now again, spinning, twisting, inserting it in and out, pulling it back and forth, in and out. We're trying to get a really good layer of glue on the inside of the block and also the outside of that brass tube. Once you think you have it all glued inside, everything's looking good, we're going to put the tube in and then insert it the rest of the way with that insert tube. Double check to make sure that it's not sticking out of the ends, and then we're going to lay it flat and wipe off our insert tool. And then we can wait for it overnight. Once the glue is dried, we're going to use a barrel trimmer to clean up any glue and trim the edges of the block even with the brass tube. Using the barrel trimmer and the cordless drill, we want the shaft of the trimmer to go all the way in before we pull the trigger and start to cut. And we only cut far enough to see the shiny brass ring on that. We're going to flip it over, do the second side. Again, get the shaft of that barrel trimmer all the way in before you pull the trigger. And just go deep enough till you see the brass ring on the edge of that tube. That side is done. Now we're going to do the other block. Once you see the brass ring, you've gone far enough. You don't want to cut too far or it'll change the dynamic of your pen. All the way down, turn it on, just go to the brass tube. Now we're going to use the countersink tool to just clean up the end of that brass tube by spinning the point of the countersink tool into each end of the tubes and the blocks, and then it'll be ready to go onto the lathe. When we put it on the lathe, we want to make sure we've got that grain indicator line that we marked way back at the beginning, so that we line the grain up as we're creating our pen. We're going to take off the nut and bushings, leaving 2 bushings. Put one of the blocks back on. Make sure that your grain indicating line faces towards the center. We'll slide 1 more bushing on, taking the second block with the grain line so that they match up in the middle. And then we're going to put the last 2 bushings and the nut on. Again, making sure our grain line, and we're using the blocks from the same piece. Slide the tailstock into the end of the mandrel, and then we want to move the tool rest close to the mandrel, locking it in place. And then we're going to check to make sure that the block does not hit the tool rest as we are spinning, so that when we turn on the lathe, it doesn't hit the tool block, the tool rest, and break apart. We're going to cut with just the very end of the gouge, the roughing gouge. We're going to anchor it, bevel, and then cut. So we touch it to the tool rest to anchor it. Listen for the tatter of the bevel, and then we rotate the handle for cutting. Slowly move that cutter back and forth side to side. You'll notice that the blocks weren't tight enough, so we're going to tighten the nut on the end of the mandrel and make sure, and you can see that we've already started to cut the corners round. Now anchor, bevel, and cut, and we're just going to slowly go back and forth across and cut those blocks into something that resembles a cylinder rather than the rectangular shape that they were when we first put them on. You can dump off any sawdust out of the gouge so that you keep your tool clean. Now you can see that we've gotten everything round. We want to plan for which end we want the tip of the pen. Do we want the tip on the left with the clip and cap on the right, or do we want to vice versa? Some people like to turn the pen with the tip to the right. I like to do mine with the tip to the left, and then I plan for the center, and the right end is going to be the top of my pen. So now I'm going to complete my shape by carving it a little bit further and taking it to my desired shape, leaving the ends just slightly larger than the diameter of the bushing. We want the wood to be just a little bit longer or wider than the bushing, so that we give ourselves some room for sanding once we've got everything done with the cutting. So I'm going to keep shaping, get to a desired shape. I'm working the ends close to the side of the bushing, but not taking it all the way down even. You can feel the edges there. It's just slightly larger than that bushing. Again, that's going to allow for room for sanding, since we aren't going to have a perfectly smooth finish when we're done cutting. Moving slowly, nice even pressure. Double checking to see that we're close. I can dump out the shavings to keep my tool clean. And then I'm going to turn it off, examine it closer, make sure that my edges are where I want to be. And if I'm still a little bit bigger, I can take a little bit more off. Again, I do not want to go all the way to the finished size of the bushing. I want there to be room to sand so that when I'm done sanding, I'm even with that size of the bushing. The size of the bushing is equal to the size of the completed pen parts. So that's our target size. When we're all done sanding and polishing, we want our ends of our wood to be even with the size of the bushing. Taking my sandpaper pack, I'm going to sort through my different grits of sandpaper. There are 7 different grits. I'm going to line them all up in order and then work from the lowest number to the highest number. So I have 100, 150, 180, 220, 320, 400, and 600. So working through, all of the sandpaper is labeled on the back. I'm going to move my tool rest out of the way so that I have room to move with my sandpaper. Now with the 100 grit, with one hand above and one below, I hold the 2 ends of the sandpaper and just move it gently side to side over the block of wood. I'm going to do both blocks. I'm looking to take out any scratches or marks from the gouge. And then I'm going to move up to the 150 grit. Again, moving side to side. When sanding, you want to make sure that you are not hitting the bushings, the little metal spacers. We do not want to sand those because it does change the size of the bushings if we're sanding them, and that affects the completed pen later on. If our bushings aren't the right size, our wood blocks won't be the right size. So with the 180 now, again, now we're just taking away the scratches and smoothing from the sandpaper grit below. I'm going to go to 220. Double checking to make sure that we're getting close to the size of the bushing. By the time we're finished with the 220 and 320 sandpaper, we want our wooden blocks to be even with the bushings, because with the 400 and 600 we will not be removing a lot of material. It's just final sanding and cleaning up scratches from the grits beforehand. So at the 320, when we're finished with 320, we should be even, the ends of our wood blocks, even with those bushings. So even at the ends with that 320. Now I'm going to go with my 400. And I'm going to just polish up a little bit, take any scratches away that we might have made with the 320 grit. And now I'm going to turn off the machine with the 400, and I'm going to sand by hand, slowly rotating it by hand to make sure that my sanding is going with the grain lines, which will help to hide any last scratches that the sandpaper may be leaving. Again, try not to sand the bushings. And then with the 600, we're going to turn the lathe back on. Final sanding, we're going to turn it off, and again with the 600, go with the grain to take away any last grain line or scratches from the sandpaper while the lathe was running. Again, we want to try not to hit those metal bushings because we don't want to change the size. Now we want to save the 600 because our next step is to start the polishes, and we're going to come one more time with the 600 afterwards. We're going to take one piece of paper towel, we need half of it, and then we're going to take that piece and divide it into 4, and we're going to use one piece for each of the 4 polishes. I'm going to fold up the first piece into a nice little strip, and I'm going to put a couple of drops of super glue onto the paper towel, close up the bottle of super glue, and now I'm going to run that over the pen. This is going to help seal the fibers of the wood, and it takes the sawdust that we had from sanding off of it. We're going to leave the lathe run for about 1 minute, and then with the 600 grit sandpaper we're going to come back over it, buff it out, and just smooth out anything that may have dripped or been too thick with the super glue. This is going to prepare a nice smooth finish for us to use as we move forward with the other finishes that we're going to use. We're going to be applying 2 more waxes and a friction polish to the completed pen. Now that we've got everything sanded, we're going to go one more time with the grain. Making sure that we've got a really nice smooth pen that's all sealed up. Our next polish is called Scratch Free. We're going to put just a little bit on your fingertip, rub it into the pen. We're going to turn on the lathe and rub it in real good, and then make sure we get that covered up so we don't get sawdust and stuff in there. Rub it in real good. Then we're going to take one of those small pieces of paper towel that we ripped earlier and wipe all of that polish back off, making sure that we keep using a clean rag or a clean section of that paper towel and really get that buffed off, which is going to help to polish it. Now that all of that is off, we're going to take another piece of paper towel and move forward with the next finish. But we're going to double check, make sure everything is off and cleaned up. It's nice and smooth, it's starting to polish. With the friction polish, you may see that it's settled. If it settles, you want to make sure you cover the cap with your finger, shake it, mix it up really good, ready for us to use with a new piece of paper towel. So now that it's all mixed up, fold my paper towel like we did with the super glue at the beginning. Nice thick strip. We're going to take the cap off. Put a couple of drops onto the middle of our paper towel. Make sure that we put that cap back on. We do not want to lose it. Make sure that thing gets back on. We're going to turn the lathe back on and rub that friction polish across our pieces. Then we're going to take the paper towel, fold it up a little thicker, because we want to apply some pressure to it to heat up that friction polish. As the name implies, the more friction we have, the the nicer the polish is going to be and the shinier that pen is going to become. So rubbing it back and forth, you can really start to see it shine, and it's getting a really, really nice high gloss polish to it. The last step is the Renaissance wax. And again, we're going to just take a little tiny bit of this on our finger, and we're going to rub it into the wood as it's spinning on the lathe. We want to rub it in, and we're going to let it sit for about a minute or so. And then after that polish has kind of set up and gotten a little tacky, we're going to come back with the piece of paper towel, and we're going to buff it off really nice, really rubbing it in, which is going to again bring back a really nice highly glossy shine. Now we're ready to remove our pen from the lathe. Double check everything. If it looks good, we're going to move the tool rest out of the way once more. We're going to move the tailstock back. Take the brass nut off of the end of the mandrel. Carefully remove a couple of the bushings. Make sure that as you take the pen off the lathe, we are keeping it lined up so that we're not mixing up the direction of the grain. I'm going to slide back the bushings, put the nut back on, and then it's very important to slide that tailstock back into the mandrel and lock it in place. Heading to the pen press, we're going to take our pen kit, lay our two pieces down. We're going to empty out the pen bag with all the parts, saving the big bag as our packaging for later. Make sure we have all of our parts. And we're going to start laying them out in an order in which we're going to start putting stuff together. We're going to put the tip of the pen on the end of the wood that we had set up in the lathe for the front. We're going to take the cap, put that near the back end or the top of the pen. We're going to set the clip back there with the cap. And then the last piece that we have here is the center band, and that's going to go right in the middle as we assemble our pen. Starting out with the tip and the bottom or front end of the pen, we're going to slide the tip into the black part of the pen press. Make sure that it's fit nice and straight. We're going to flip up as many of the spacers as we can. And then we're going to squeeze the pen press together until the pen tip and the wood block come together nicely. The next part is going to be to take the brass end of the twist piece, put it in the other end of that bottom wooden pen part, flip up the spacers again. We're going to squeeze that just until we are about to the little indent circle at the end there, and then we're going to test the ink to make sure that the ink comes out far enough. If we're not happy with the ink, we can take it back out and press it a little bit further, and we can take it all the way up to that indent line to make sure that our ink is going to come out all the way we want. By just squeezing a little bit more, taking the pen ink, twisting it in, we can see now that our tip is coming out the way we want. I can then take the little center band, slide it over the twist piece and the ink into place. And now I'm going to take the back end and the clip and the cap, slide the clip and cap, put it into the end of our wood block. We're going to again slide it into the pen press, lift up as many spacers, and holding it in place, we're going to squeeze the cap in tight so that the clip and the cap are pressed in snugly to the end. We can then slide our two pen halves together, test to make sure it's opening, and then we can line up the grain. So we want to move the pen by spinning the top piece that spins freely to line up our grain. When we're all finished, we can then put our completed pen into the original parts bag, and we have our completed pen. Thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope you have fun turning your pens. Thank you.